I should say, well, another minute and then we will start, right?
Yeah, waiting for other people.
Okay. I think I will start now, right? Okay. Ja, guten Abend und herzlich willkommen zu einem weiteren virtuellen Migwan Kulturabend. Mein Name ist Ora Mendelberg und ich bin verantwortlich für kulturelle Veranstaltungen. Gerne möchte ich vorab die Gelegenheit nutzen und ein paar persönliche Worte an Sie richten. Migwan Kultur möchte zukünftig neue Akzente setzen, um diesen Bereich auszuweiten und mit breit gefächerten Themen zu beleben. Dazu möchte ich Sie einladen und ermuntern, mitzugestalten. Haben Sie Ideen und möchten Sie aktiv die einbringen, dann bitte ich Sie doch, sich an mich zu wenden. Ich werde meinen Kontakt noch im Chat dann ersichtlich machen. Die Beiträge können in Wissenschaft, Kunst, Musik, Literatur oder auch in Reiseerfahrungen verortet sein. Wünschenswerterweise in Verbindung zum Judentum, jedoch nicht ausschließlich. Beiträge sind in Deutsch wie auch in Englisch willkommen. Über Ihr Engagement und natürlich Ihr Einbringen freuen wir uns sehr und es führt sicherlich auch zu einer Stärkung unserer Gemeinde. Ich würde mich sehr freuen. Falls Sie den Flyer zum heutigen Abend aufmerksam gelesen haben, dürfte Ihnen der Satz aus dem Psalm 71, Kapitel 9, auf den mich unser Rabbiner Akiva Weingarten während der Vorbereitung zum heutigen Vortrag aufmerksam gemacht hat, aufgefallen sein und den ich als hoffnungsvolle Brücke zum heutigen Thema sehe. Intelligent or smart technology to find tremor oder intelligente Technologie gegen den Tremor. Verwirf mich nicht im Alter, verlass mich nicht, wenn ich schwach werde. Do not cast me away when I'm old, do not forsake me when my strength is gone. Und damit kommen wir zum Highlight des Abends. Lassen Sie mich Ihnen Dr. Nir Grossman vorstellen. Nir ist Assistenzprofessor für Gehirnwissenschaften am Imperial College London und Gründungsmitglied der UK Demenz Forschungsinstitut. Seine Forschungsarbeit konzentriert sich auf nicht invasive physische Interventionen für Menschen mit neurodegenerativen Krankheiten wie Alzheimer und Parkinson. Krankheiten, die jeden von uns in einer oder in einer anderen Form treffen können und unser Leben so schleichend auch verändern. Ich lade Sie nun ein, dabei zu sein. Ich freue mich, dass Nir mit uns ist. Sie können jederzeit ihn unterbrechen, wenn Sie Fragen haben, die Sie brennen, und er wird sie Ihnen sehr gerne beantworten. Well, Nir, the floor and the mic is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Aura. Thank you for the nice introduction, and I hope you hear me well. And as Era said, this is a very non-structured, non-official presentation. Feel free to stop me in any point. My presentation could be a start for discussion. A few words about myself. As you probably get from my accent, I grew up and actually was born in Israel, in Rishon LeZion. After the military service, I did the first degree in the Technion in Haifa, in Israel, in physics. And then I moved with my wife to Germany. My wife currently is German. And then I did a second degree or master degree in electromagnetism and engineering in Hamburg. And following that, we moved to London, where I did a PhD in neuroscience. After the PhD in neuroscience, shortly after that, we moved to Boston, where I had a postdoc training in MIT and in Harvard. After that, came back to London, where the family is physically located here in Loach. So we live in Loach. And I commute between here and London in non-corona time and very regular base. Now work predominantly from home. As Aura said, I lead the lab in Imperial College London, and I was recruited to a new institute called the UK Dementia Research Institute, which is a cross-institutional, a cross-university institute. We have a center in Imperial College in London, in UCL, in Cambridge, Cardiff, Edinburgh, and King's College London. So each one was specialized in different area of the research. And as you understand from my background, I actually don't have a strong background in neurodegeneration or in dementia. And that was exactly the reason why they brought me into this research, because the field in the last couple of years entering essentially a crisis and looking for new opinion and new ideas. And that was the reason that brought me in as with my background and expertise. So that's about myself. So there are about 1 billion people around the world that suffer from brain disorders, costing our world economy trillions of dollars annually. One of the most significant brain disorders and a priority worldwide is dementia. Dementia is a neurodegenerative disease. When we say neurodegenerative disease, we basically look at the brain that start to dissolve itself. So here we see, hope you can see my cursor. This is a normal brain. And this is just a cross section of that. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
No? Yeah. You can see clearly that the brain looks very different. The brain is starting to degenerate itself, and you can see the holes, the ventriculus area, larger and larger. And this is one of the major challenge of modern medicine, especially with the aging population. So a few facts about dementia. Dementia is a major neurodegenerative brain disease leading to a progressive loss of cognitive functions. And here we can see a list of that, eventually covering all aspects of life, but starting in regions that are associated with memory. Worldwide, there are about 50 million people living with dementia, and it's projected to triple to 152 million in 2050. Alzheimer's disease is the major cause of dementia. About 60 to 70% of dementia cases are due to Alzheimer's disease. Dementia, as you probably know, is accelerated with age, or the prevalence or the risk of dementia accelerate with age. So this is statistics for EU. At the age of 65, we're talking about 1.3% of the population, and that was 75, 8% of the population, 85, 25, 21%, and then 90 is actually every second person will have dementia. There is no effective treatment, absolutely nothing for dementia. So before we start, I was wondering if maybe people can reflect, how many of you know someone or knew someone with dementia? Maybe raise your hand or virtually raise your hand. It's just kind of a feeling of where we are. There is an option to virtually raise your hand, or just open your camera, raise your hand if you know someone with dementia. So I see few of us, maybe quarter, half of the people, if I get it correctly. Is anyone here ready to, because actually a lot of people don't encounter person with dementia and Alzheimer. In a very brief, somebody that had an occurrence with dementia can give his or her experience really shortly. If you want to unmute and just say a few words, that would be fantastic. It will give the context for what we're talking about. Just unmute and say whatever you know you feel.
I used to nurse a lady, and her husband explained me gradually, very well, how dementia developed in his wife. She used to go to gymnastic lessons, and one day she didn't find her way back again. She used to do it for years and years, and just one day she got really literally lost. And that is when they actually took her to the hospital, and they made diagnosis and tests, and then they diagnosed that she has actually dementia.
Yeah, thank you. That is, as you said, this is very common pattern. So the loss of orientation is listed here. And we will talk about it later, but the degeneration out in deep structure inside the brain that is associated with forming new memories. And hence the people first lose the ability in Alzheimer's to form new memories. And gradually, as it progresses to other regions of the brain, affecting every aspect of life, and importantly, also as affecting our personality, or the personality. It's becoming different people with different personality, often very agitated, often with sleep disorders, and hence lose their independence. And when we talk about dementia and Alzheimer, we talk not about the patient suffering. It's a huge undertake to the carer and the family that associated with this. It's enormous. And I encourage you to either speak with someone or look in the internet about stories. This is heartbreaking. Thank you, Aura. So, of course, this is a short presentation. What I thought we can talk about today is just to give you a flavor of the principle of what is neurodegeneration, specifically in Alzheimer's disease. What we know about the mechanism that drive this neurodegeneration, and we talk specifically about what is called the amyloid beta hypothesis. This is the dogma that has ruled or governed the research and development for the last 30 years. And then we discuss possible interventional strategies, And then specifically as one of them, neuromodulation, that is essentially my expertise, neuromodulation. And I will show you an example of two neuromodulation strategies for intervention. When we say neuromodulation, I will speak interchangeably between neuromodulation and brain stimulation. One of them is to target deep structures in the brain. I'll talk about the motivation, the concept, and the validation we have done to date for that. And then the development of a strategy we call phase lock brain stimulation to mitigate tremor, as Aura referred to in the beginning. Tremor being key symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is another neurodegenerative disease. It's just that the neurodegeneration occurs in different region of the brain or starter, and 50% of the people with Parkinson's will end up with dementia as well, I mean with cognitive symptoms. Right, and again, feel free to stop me at any point. So let's start with the basic thing. What are these neuron cells? We talk about neurodegeneration. What is neurons? What are neuron cells? So if we look on a cross section of our brain or our head, here we see our skull. Here's the cross section. We have fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, and here is the brain. And if we zoom in, if we take a cross section of our brain or the surface of the brain, which we call the cortex, one will see these kind of things. It is basically structure, planar structures of neuron cells. These are all different type of cells in our brain. And if we look at an illustration of a cell will have, this is of course an illustration. It will have essentially a dendrites, which are these kind of arms that receive input from many other neuron cells. Yeah, on the order of 1,000 to hundreds of thousands of basically neurons will communicate with a single neuron via this kind of dendritic input. And the small signals that come from this dendrite will accumulate in the cell body called the stoma. Mm-hmm. And if the sum of them in a particular time is sufficiently large, there will be what we call an action potential. The neuron will start to send an output. The output signal will go through a very narrow leg called the axon that will go to other neural cells, and a much smaller number, let's say up to 1,000. This type, all our mental function, everything, is based on these electrochemical signals between a complex network of about 100 billion neuron cells like that. All this communication between them, the way they are connected, this is responsible for all our mental, motoric functionality. So let's think about a second. So if we have a cell in our brain that has this kind of, needs to have this functionality, these are unique cells. That we have cells all over the body, of course. These are very unique cells, neurons. And they have a very specific functionality. They need to take input from many, many cells and then process them and send an output to allow us cognitive and mental functionality. So, of course, the functionality depends on thousands of other cells that gives them the input. So the neural network activity will affect their own activity, or the activity of a single cell. But also to maintain that, of course, they need an energy supply. They need a supply of energy that will allow them to maintain this activity. On top of that, when a cell like us consume energy, there is a waste from the cell that's being developed. And this waste needs to be cleared out of the cell. Otherwise, like our cell, it becomes toxic.
Nir?
Yeah.
There's probably a question from Smada.
Yeah.
She has to unmute herself.
That's great. At the moment, I'm not monitoring the chat. So
oh, no, she says no. She says no, sorry. She says no.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Again, feel free to stop me in any moment. So to maintain this capability, we said the cell needs also waste clearance, basically infrastructure around it. And the last thing that the cell needs is essentially immune protection. That is any virus or other attack on our brain or our cells or bacteria. We need an immune system to protect the cells. And this is what we call cell homeostasis. So essentially what we are saying that the functionality of a single neural cells depends on the input of a large network of cells, meaning if the level of the input will affect how much energy each neuron cell will need. And it requires metabolic, energetic, and immune support, aka what we call cell homeostasis. And essentially what's happened in neurodegeneration is the breakdown of this cell homeostasis, this kind of equilibrium, steady state of the right level of activity input to a cell, the sufficient energy supply, and the clearance of the energy, and the right immune protection. Either one of them fails, the neurons start to die. Any of them depend on that. And for decades, the assumption was that at least in Alzheimer, the key impairment was the waste clearance. The problem was the waste clearance. That is the thing that caused the cells to die in Alzheimer's disease. And the reason for that is coming from Alzheimer itself. So this is Alois Alzheimer. He essentially is a German psychiatrist and physicist who identified the first patient with these symptoms. And when he looked at the brain, he saw these huge debris, as you can see here. And these are essentially what we call protein called amyloid beta. And this protein aggregates itself into plaques at the outside the cells, and inside the cells is we found what we call neurofilaments tangles. Inside the cells, again, aggregates of peptides inside the cells. These are abnormal. So these are all waste that were not cleared well enough from our brain and became toxic. So and in a sense, we developed capability to image that, image this plaques level in humans using positron emission tomography. Positron emission tomography is based on injecting radioligand to our blood that go through a blood supply, entering the brain, and it can attach essentially to this plaque in this case, and then we can image and see how many of them. So if this is the brain, a healthy brain, and this is the amount of plaque we have there, you can see the huge difference that exists with Alzheimer's patient, the amount of these plaques, and hence to date, PET imaging of amyloid beta plaques is the main diagnostic criterion for Alzheimer's disease. We need the symptoms, but the ultimate diagnosis is coming from this PET imaging of amyloid beta plaques.
May I ask you something?
Of course.
The accumulation of many plaques are in the forebrain. Is this explaining the functional deficiency? Or and why is it in the forebrain and in the parietal lobes?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the plane where we are looking at. And this plane, again, as was mentioned, we see a higher concentration in the frontal cortex or the frontal area of the brain or lobe, and then the parietal one. This is names we use to kind of distinct different lobes or areas inside in the brain. But in fact, this is in a relatively late stage of the disease. And at late stage of the disease, it's across the brain. It's starting, and I will come to that later, in the limbic system, essentially, in the area called near the hippocampus and the hippocampus itself. And from there, it's propagating predominantly to the frontal cortex. And indeed, to some degree, there's been a challenge. There has been always a dissonance between the distribution or even the level of these plaques in the brain and the symptoms, the cognitive symptoms that patients have, meaning many people can have this enormous amount of plaque, but still demonstrating very minor cognitive impairment. And that has been kind of the mystery for long in the field, and may explain why we are, as I will come in a step soon, trying to go in a more holistic, think about the disease in a more holistic way. So to answer your question, in this image, it looks like there's in this plane, looks like there is a strong accumulation at the frontal and the parietal, but this is a late stage. It exists across all the brain. It's not necessarily starting there, and it's not always directly correlated with the symptoms. Okay. So this, the notion that we see this plaque in the brain essentially led to this amyloid beta hypothesis that's saying, hey, the aggregation of this amyloid beta plaque is a cause. It's not just something we see. It's not that the byproduct is, we believe, the hypothesis states that causes essentially Alzheimer's disease. And if we are able to essentially mitigate it or eliminate this plaque, we will cure the disease. That has been the dogma that essentially dominated the Alzheimer's disease research for the last 30 years, or more even. And that led to hundreds of clinical trials of different, basically, drugs or intervention to try to clear the amyloid beta, and billions of dollars. Here's an example, even to date, what we can see already in clinical trials. You can see that we can divide clinical trials and just treat symptoms, but the one that are actually trying to affect disease-modifying therapy, meaning a cure, they're all related to amyloid beta. The tau is the other, basically, intracellular aggregation that I showed you before. It's all aimed essentially on clearing that. The problem is that all these clinical trials failed. All of them failed. There is no cure. And what we realized that, hey, it's not that they were not able to cure, to eliminate the plaques. The plaques were able to clear them. And different drugs were able to do that in different way, either to reduce the production of that or to increase the clearance of that. But they cure the plaques, they remove the plaques, but there was no effect or no benefit, no proven benefit to the patients to date. Now there is a new drug, it's the antibody for the plaque from Biogen, is a company in Boston that initially said they failed in their phase 3 trial, but now they're somehow saying there is some benefit for some subset of patients and so on. So this is where we are today. So that's basically, after all these years, all this investment, the realization that we need a new strategy. We need to sit back and think again on what's going on here. And that essentially led to where I am. And in 2017, the UK, as part of this kind of global crisis, opened this UK Dementia Research Institute with direct investment from the government. Same investment, same thing happens in Germany, in the US, of course, in many other countries, of course. This is a global crisis. And basically the notion that we have, yeah?
Sorry, I have a question. Can you go back to the other slide?
Of course.
Yes. So when you say they failed, did they at all slow down the progression of the disease?
No.
So
Well,
there is no drug on the market that slows down the progression?
No, there's nothing in this. There is a drug that can help a bit the symptoms, and cholinergic drugs that is approved, but it does not slow down the neurodegeneration. At the moment, there's nothing.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, we separate between disease-modifying therapies that will basically stop or reverse the disease, and one to deal with specific aspect of the symptoms. Yeah. So you can see here some hormonal therapy and some metabolic. So depending on different basically food or dietary can help affect a bit the symptoms, but it doesn't stop the disease and it doesn't slow it down. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So the notion we have today is essentially that, hey, it's not that just that there is an impaired ways of clearance, but essentially all of them, all of this aspect of the homeostasis play a role in one way or another. We have essentially dysfunctional energy supply to the region of the brain that are degenerated. There is essentially neuroinflammation within our immune cells called microglia in the brain, attacking our own cells and killing them. And all of that is coming together where the whole activity in the brain is completely abnormal or aberrant. And more than that, they're all related to each other. There is a mechanism of interdependency of all of these drivers that enough that one of them, it can start from any of them, eventually will all play a role, they're all interconnected, and they all lead essentially to the new degeneration of the cells. That's the picture that we have today. And of course now it's about going and understand the details of that, of this kind of biomechanism of that. And my team is focused on the aberrant neural network activity. And I will elaborate it now. So the scientific framework of my research is basically that aberrant neural activity play a critical role in neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer. It does that, not when I talk about neural activity, I talk about this thousands and hundreds of thousands of neural activity and the activity between them, the level of activity and how the level and the exact pattern of activity that is completely disrupted at the very, very, very early stage of the disease, before any symptoms and before even we see the plaques. There is a change in activity. And importantly, as I mentioned before, our mental capability and functionality depends on that. So if we have aberrant activity in the brain, we have impaired mental functionality. And more than that, all these cellular homeostasis processes I told you before, such as the energy supply and the clearance, they all depend on the activity level of the cells. There is a mechanism and processes in place for the cells to increase metabolic input based on activity and reduce and so on. And all of that is basically connected. And if you think about it from the point of view of intervention, traditionally we address or try to cure brain disorders in these two domains. So either we try to target kind of a cellular level of the problem, molecular level of the problem using drugs that will go to particular receptors in the cells, and so on. This has been the dominant approach of medicine today. And of course, we address that at the behavior level. For example, psychotherapy is an example for psychiatric disorders, or physiotherapy is an example of behavior therapy. So we look at the disease at a very different level. We look at the interface between them, essentially at the communication or the network of these hundreds of thousands of cells. And the way we intervene is using brain stimulation or means to directly control the activity of the cells. This is basically what we do. And specifically, one can divide neuromodulation intervention to two. One of them is, one example is deep brain stimulation. So in this case, if we need to target a very deep structure, in this case, this is a thalamus, we insert electrode into the brain and essentially stimulate it electrically. As I mentioned, the communication between the cells is electrochemical and hence is very sensitive to electric field. So by applying electric fields from these electrodes, we can drive a controlled activity that is abnormal there. And therefore, and this is an approved strategy or therapy for Parkinson's disease, dystonia, essential tremor, and obsessive compulsive disorder. This is of course very focal and can get deep structure, but of course the problem is a brain surgery. This is what will be the equivalent of a pacemaker for the heart. Yeah, so it's pacing essentially the region of the brain that its activity is abnormal. On the other hand, we have a non-invasive stimulation, and here's an example of that, where we put either magnets, electromagnets, or electrodes on the head. If somebody did the ECG or EEG, is a similar thing. If we put electrodes on the scalp and apply current through that, of course produces a weaker field inside the brain. But such a therapy, as an example, is FDA approved for depression. So in this case, the stimulation of the frontal cortex or also the prefrontal cortex region that is approved for depression. The advantage here, it's a non-invasive. The disadvantage is this is very dispersed. We don't get a focal point, and it's just target basically superficial structure. And the reason for that is when we apply current, for example, from outside, the magnitude of the field that we apply decays with the distance. So there will be always stronger stimulation underneath the electron. So there we get first the cortex. So the challenge we try to tackle is whether we can develop a technology that allow us for the first time to target deep structure non-invasively. So without the need for this surgery, but still able to get this deep structure. This has been a long-term challenge. For centuries, people try to solve that, and we develop a solution for that. And this is what I will talk about now. So,
may I ask you something? Sorry to disturb.
Of course, please go.
When you have the brain stimulation in major depressive disorder,
yeah,
for how long does it activate?
Yeah,
or inhibit the depression?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The therapy is typically a stimulation of about 10 minutes for an hour per day for 5 days a week for up to 6 weeks. And after that, people typically either go to full remission, so full recovery from the major depression, or will need maintenance of stimulation after a year or so. That is the approved protocol. And one of the reasons for, if we are talking about depression, if there's an interest in that, the idea, or essentially the concept behind it, that people with depression have essentially high synchronization at the frontal cortex. This is the area that we use for cognitive functionality. It's highly synchronized, it's over busy with itself essentially, and connected to the limbic system, which are emotional system. So it's incapable to process information, external information well. And this stimulation is able to release essentially the intrinsic connectivity that existed by forcing this different pattern of activity. That is the principle behind that. Any other questions related to that?
Yes, I have a question also.
Yeah.
What were some of the side effects that you have found in these therapies?
That's a great question. Of course, let's start with the deep brain stimulation. So this is, of course, an invasive surgery. You have all the risk of infection associated with basically opening up the skull and putting electrode inside. On top of that, the stimulation target a relatively small region, but this is a very important region deep in the brain that often these people will develop psychiatrics, basically disorders such as depression and maybe even verbal difficulties due to the stimulation. Now, to put it in context, this is the last resource for patients. This is not the first-line therapy. So these patients essentially in severe, basically morbidity, and hence there's a balance between kind of the benefits and the risk, and for them it makes sense. But of course, this cannot be scaled up for any patients. In the context of the transcranial stimulation for depression, well, there are not a lot of side effects. There is the risk associated with the stimulation that people may develop seizure, but this is very, very uncommon. And of course, there could be headaches. That could be something that can develop. So people can have headache, especially immediately after the stimulation, and feel sleepy. But they are not common, strong, basically, side effects that I'm aware of. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, I have also a question. What do the people feel like when they get this stimulation?
Right. So
express their feelings.
Right. So with a deeper stimulation, they of course don't feel the stimulation. We don't have a way to feel if we touch the brain or we stimulate the brain. There's no sensation in that. Yeah. So I encourage you to Google deep brain stimulation Parkinson's disease, and you will see videos. It's astonishing that once you turn on the stimulation, the tremor disappears. The problem is that once you stop it, the tremor goes back. It's not a cure. It just basically holds the tremor. And we're talking specifically about tremor and Parkinson's disease or dystonia essential tremor. So that's the problem. Sometimes they have problem during sleep because this kind of stimulation may affect them. And with transcranial stimulation, non-invasive stimulation, there is a sensation because the skin is between us and the brain, and of course the skull is but in the skin we have sensation. We have neurons that basically tactile neurons. So people may feel some kind of tapping. It's like tapping on the skull. Yeah, that is basically what people feel. And with electrical stimulation, if the stimulation is too strong, they may feel some burning sensation underneath the electrode, and this is often our limiting factor. And I guess some of you are aware with electroconvulsive therapy, which is basically people with severe depression can get what we call the electric shock. This is using a very, very much amount of current that literally induce seizure across the brain. This is done under anesthesia, and this is in a different scale for what we are talking here. We are talking about thousands of times weaker, basically, field that done without an anesthesia, fully awake. People may feel a bit of discomfort, such as basically, as I said, tapping or some tingling on the skin, but that's about that. It's not the same level. Okay. Great. So the notion or the need to go to deep structure is, as I alluded before, also motivated by Alzheimer's disease. The Alzheimer's disease, the disease itself, starts in this region, deep in the brain, this area called the hippocampus. As you can see, this is how the hippocampus look like as a normal person. This is the hippocampus of basically person with Alzheimer's disease. This region of the hippocampus is one of the starting sites for the neurodegeneration Alzheimer's disease, is a critical structure for binding memory. This is where we use to bind the memory, or specifically associated and learning memories. And we know that before this area is dying, before there are any symptoms, we can see high level of activity using imaging. You can see it's hyperactive, this region. So the activity of this region is abnormal at the very, very beginning of Alzheimer's disease. And hence for us, it's kind of a clear target for potential intervention. So we developed a new brain stimulation concept. We call it temporal interference brain stimulation. We talk about it at a high level. In principle, in temporal interference brain stimulation, we apply two currents to the brain. So one current via electrodes shown here in blue. And this current is goes at a very high frequency, at the kilohertz frequencies that our neurons in the brain cannot follow. They just go through them and it's too fast for them. It's transparent for these neurons, okay? Let's say, and then in the same time, we apply another current to the brain via another pair of electrodes, shown in black, at the kilohertz frequency, a high frequency is slightly different from the first one. So let's say I'm applying 1000 hertz with these blue electrodes. Hertz is basically 1 per second. Imagine you have electric current that oscillate, and this oscillation has a frequency. So let's say the frequency is about 1000 hertz. Neurons can follow up to 50 hertz. So it's a much faster from what neuron can cope with. And then the other one could be at 1010 hertz. So where these two currents create electric fields inside the brain, shown here in blue and black arrows. These electric fields are superimposed by the neurons inside the brain, where the superposition, you see here in red, at the time domain, when we look at the field, so this will be the black one oscillating, the blue one oscillating, where the two meet inside the brain, the superposition has an amplitude that change periodically, very slowly at the frequency that is equal to the different frequency of the applied current. So if I apply 1000 and 1010, where the two meet, this combined amplitude will change periodically at 10 hertz. Yeah, if I apply 1020, it will change with 20 hertz. And this occurs only where they meet inside the brain. So what we showed is that the neurons in the brain can actually follow that. So to do that, this is an experiment we did in the live mice, where it's a fully anesthetized animal, where we essentially have electrodes here and another electrode here. Each one of them has another return electrode somewhere on the thorax of the animal. And we open the skull and enter with a pipette that has a diameter of about 1 micrometer, enter into a single neuron cells inside the live brain and record the activity of a single cell while we are stimulating. So this is a common technique called patch clamp recording. And if we apply a conventional stimulation, so let's say we apply this kind of periodic 10 hertz of a stimulation in a frequency that neuron can follow. You can see this is the activity of the single cell, that the neuron have spikes. It sends this signal and this is a zoom view of that. This is how it looks like at 10 hertz. So each time we go to the maximum, the neuron will just basically send a signal. We directly control the neuron with our electric field. And this is just showing repetition of the same thing. And if we apply a very high frequency, as I said, 2 kilohertz in this case, after some transient thing, there's nothing happens. The neuron just don't see that. It's just going transparent. The neuron cannot follow it up. Nothing happens. But if we are applying these two frequencies, 2000 to 2 kilohertz and 2010, when the two erupt sufficiently, the neurons start to spike at the different frequency, in this case 10 hertz, in a very similar way as it will be in 10 hertz. That means it demonstrates that neurons can pick up the difference and the frequency of the two basically high frequency that we apply. And remember, I showed you before, in principle, it's happened, they are summing together just deep in the brain. This is demonstrating, yeah?
But why wouldn't you simply stimulate with 10 hertz?
Sorry?
Why wouldn't you just simply stimulate with 10 hertz
that's a
with
good
one
question.
electrode?
Yeah, let's go back here and I will explain that. So if we will apply a simple 10 hertz, so the maximum, the strongest field of 10 hertz will be directly underneath the electrodes. So it will be in this location and that location. It will stimulate the surface of the electrodes because the electric field decays as we go away from the electrodes.
So it's like deep brain stimulation with the external electrodes, right?
So that's exactly what we are trying to achieve here, to develop a deep brain stimulation, so a deep structure, but without the need to insert electrode to the brain. That's exactly the challenge that we're trying to solve. Yeah. So the first proof was that, hey, neurons can follow this pattern of 2 kilohertz frequency and basically respond to the difference between them. So then we kind of look this kind of distribution of this envelope. And I won't go into too much details here. This is a kind of a physics experiment where we simulate and measure the fields. So we apply current between this electrode, and we apply current between this electrode, and we essentially simulate and measure the distribution of this envelope, of this kind of change in the amplitude when the two are combined, okay? So we just want to see how it's distributed in the brain. And what we found that if we, so you can see this is kind of a trapezoid, and if we increase the distance in the narrow base of the trapezoid, we started to see that the location of the stimulation of the envelope modulation will start to move inside the brain. Or inside, this is a phantom, it's not the brain. It's like it's kind of this is the first thing we do to get a feeling of where potentially it will be. And we have a configuration like this. Again, we apply current this way and another current this way. We get the peak of this kind of change directly in the middle of the brain. So then we basically wanted to test whether we can use this principle to recruit the activity in a deep structure, in this case, the hippocampus, and do that without stimulating the cortex that is overlaying them. So the cortex is the surface of the brain. The hippocampus, you can see here, this is the hippocampus. And again, this is an experiment we did in mice, where this will be the electrode applied on the skull of the mouse. Each one of them has another return electrode. We stimulated the animal for about 20, it's all anesthetized animal, for about 20 minutes. And then what's happening that if the neuron are active, there is a process of gene expression that related to the change in activity. And one of these is a gene or a protein called CFOS. So when we can essentially, we can do staining or immunohistochemistry to see where in the brain there is expression of this protein that is related to an increase of activity. So that is what we did. And we compare our stimulation to a controlled stimulation, the 10 hertz that we discussed before. And in the case of 10 hertz, we call it here normal, we saw that there was a strong activity of this CFOS in the hippocampus, yeah. However, there's also a strong expression on the cortex above it, yeah. While with our temper interference stimulation, we got the hippocampus. That means the field was strong enough to go all the way to the hippocampus, but we did it without stimulating the overlying cortex. And here's a representative, basically, slice for that. So this will be our overlaying cortex. Here's our hippocampus. And this is after temper interference stimulation. You can see an activation, this kind of shining green, that we got this region of the hippocampus called the dental gyrus very strongly. And we did it. So if you zoom here, you can see these are individual cells, and this is the expression of them. And if these are kind of other region of the hippocampus also expressing CFOS, but we did it without any change or expression in the cortex above them. That means we got the hippocampus selectively without the overlying cortex. This is the first demonstration of non-invasive deep brain stimulation. And once we published this in 2017, that led to a lot of enthusiasm in the field. And this is an example across the world. This is an example of article immediately came out by the New York Times and the Guardian when he published the paper. And a year later, we got the prize from the American Association for Advanced Science for the development of this technique, temper interference stimulation. And what we work on now is essentially the translation of that in humans. This is what they're doing in Imperial and with collaboration across the world. So the first experiment we did is trying to get into the cortex just to see if we can change the activity in the brain and if it's safe for the people and so on. So we position our electrode on the scalp of the people, applying current in this way and that way, and look at the region underneath near this electrode. And we did it inside the MRI. And with the MRI, we can record what we call bold signal or blood oxygen level dependent MRI. So MRI is magnetic resonant imaging, is a way to image the structure of the brain. But we also, it's also a method we can look or approximate neural activity in humans by looking on change in the oxygen of the blood. So if there is an increase of activity in brain, that will lead to a change in the oxygen concentration. It's very similar to pulse oximeter that we use to measure pulse. This is a method with magnetic resonance to look at activity in the. I see how much time I have.
Well, I give you another 10 minutes, and maybe there are some more questions at the end. Would that be fine for you?
That'll be fine. I will just go a bit faster.
Okay.
But I mean, please stop me. There's no need to go through all of that. Right. So basically, this is what we did, and this is an example of our results. We able to simulate and to predict where will be the stimulation. This is simulation of one subject, a healthy subject, of course, and this is all of them are now healthy. It's not patients yet. And we predicted there was stimulation would be here, and then we see that this is significant change in the bold signal of this subject, and we could see that across the group of people we tested, we have a large activation on this kind of frontal region where we predicted it, and then we can steer it or predict that it's going to a more posterior region, and this is what we got. So this was the first basically proof of concept we had in humans, and then we basically the next test is to test whether we can recruit the hippocampus in human brain, and this again healthy people. To do that, it's a bit more complicated. The way we did it is using combination of a task, a cognitive task that is we know to recruit activity in the hippocampus. So this is an example of what the subject need to do. They need, this is called a face name association memory task. So we will show them a face and a name, and another face and a name. We show them 16 of them in a row. There's a pause after that, and then we show a face with 5 options of name, and they need to click a button which name correspond to this face. Yeah, so there is this is an encoding of memory, and this is the recall of the memory, and it's very established, and we see it as well in our data that during the encoding of the memory, there is a very strong signal in the hippocampus. The hippocampus needs to be active to be able to bind this memory. It does not exist during the recall. It's specific for the encoding stage. And I don't show the full results here because it's not published, but basically we could demonstrate that we can change this signal specifically in the hippocampus during this test and affect the performance in healthy participant. And based on these results, we are now starting a phase 2 clinical trial in Alzheimer's patients this year. And just the notion that we are doing it, this is funded by the American Alzheimer's Association and by Bill Gates. It's an extremely expensive trial with a lot of imaging, and that the fact that we just got and starting that got a lot of attraction also in the media. Right.
I'd like to ask you something.
Yeah.
The experiment with in the MRI, did you see any better task performance?
Yes, so not inside the MRI. It's a good question. In fact, in the MRI, we designed the task by changing, for example, how long the people needs to hold the memory, so the stimulation does not affect the memory, because we wanted to see a direct signal that is purely from the stimulation, not from the change in behavior. But when we did it outside the MRI, we do see that we can accelerate the time it takes to people to respond or to recall the memory. Don't forget this.
And they were healthy subjects?
All healthy subjects, all of them young, and most of them.
You probably have a ceiling effect, don't you?
Exactly, there is a ceiling effect. I mean, before one study like that, of course, one needs to adjust the parameters to ensure there's no ceiling effect. There's a ceiling effect, meaning there's no way to improve more. They do it so fast they cannot improve, it's accurate in all the cases. So one tune the parameters, the difficulty of the task, to ensure we are not in the ceiling effect and not in chance. So they perform so bad that it's just chance. So in this case, if you think about it, the chance will be 20%, no? Because if you just randomly press a button on one of the 5 will be 20, and we get them to perform, this has the participant at about 60 to 70% accuracy, and there's enough room for a response time as well improvement. Yeah, but it's a good point. But it can be basically taken into consideration by adjusting the parameters and the difficulty of the task. So let's talk about tremor, and this is something also I mentioned in the beginning. So tremor essentially is related to brain oscillation or abnormal brain oscillation. In fact, the major cause of tremor by far is a syndrome called essential tremor, not Parkinson. In fact, in Parkinson, which you always associate with tremor, tremor is actually one of the less concerned symptoms to the majority of the patients. It's one of the many symptoms that they have. Essential tremor is the most common motoric disorder and the major cause of pathological tremor. Approximately 1/3 of essential tremor are refractory for any drug treatment, and having essential tremor increases the risk of developing dementia. And as I mentioned, it's caused by aberrant or abnormal oscillation at a particular region of the brain. In this case, one associated with the motor system. So imagine when I talk about oscillation, I mean, imagine this one is sending signal to this one, and then this one is sending signal to this region, and this region, but they're over synchronized. They're so synchronized that overall, it's just repeating itself in a cycle. So if this is kind of over synchronized, there is a signal coming up in a periodic way, and if that signal is then propagate to the thalamus to the motor cortex control the hand. The motor cortex will start to move our hand essentially, and exactly same oscillation as occur in our brain. That's basically the principle. This is why we have tremor, and we hypothesize that we may be able to stop this tremor by essentially applying stimulation at the exact time that will be uncomfortable for this kind of oscillation. So to do that, we measure the tremor with the motion sensor. We develop, and I'm not going into detail here, but that was almost 3 years of work to develop capability to, in real time, to extract the instantaneous phase of this kind of movement or oscillation and stimulate at the exact time. So the one way to think about it, imagine you have a swing, yeah? So if I send one time one side and let's say O and the other side, and I basically push the swing, and then O is pushed towards me the swing, eventually we can lead to a kind of oscillation. But if now I'm coming and at the exact right time, give another small push, take it out of synchrony, then eventually the whole swinging will just dump. And that's the idea. Can we dump this kind of oscillation by giving a stimulation in the exact right timing that can slow it down? And to do that, this is stimulation demonstrating, we put electrodes like this, transcranially, non-invasive, and this is where we will stimulate. This is an area called the cerebellum. And we design a trial that we test different phases, and I'm not going into detail. This is randomized double-blinded trial in essential tremor patients. We had 11 of them, and we showed that when this is a baseline, this is across the whole patients. As we apply this kind of phase locking, we start to reduce the tremor amplitude, and it was significant in 9 out of 11 patients at the second half of the stimulation, and in 10 out of them, even after the end of this short stimulation. This is a very short stimulation, just to see if there is something. It's maintained in most of them and even more. So this is more significant statistically, and each patient has its own unique phase that we needed to stimulate, but overall there was significant unique phase for each one of them. And we wanted to better understand what is the mechanism, what we actually do there to the brain, or to this oscillation. So what you can see here, this is a representative tremor traces from a patient where we show a decrease during the stimulation. So here the green will be the pattern of the tremor. This is indicating when there is a stimulation. And now we are zooming on this part before the stimulation, zooming on this part during the stimulation. So that will be this part and this part. And this is basically the traces of the movement. And then again, we can zoom on this part and on this part, and this is how it looks like. And then we can do to another patient when instead of getting a decrease in tremor, we get an increase. So you can see that we kind of was wondering what is different, why this one goes able to go down, what is this one is going up. And to do that, and I won't go into details, but in principle, we use a machine learning type of approach. We compute features of these traces, about 7,000 different mathematical operations, look at different features of them, and classify them to look what property or what feature of them explain the difference between this kind of suppression, tremor suppression, and the baseline. And we found that there's one particular property called information gain. Essentially, this property or this feature means that the more inconsistent the movement, or less regular the movement or coherence, the smaller the amplitude. Or put it differently, the more coherent or regular the oscillation itself, let's say the frequency of this oscillation, the larger will be the amplitude. So what essentially we have done here, we just made this oscillation unregular by perturbing it all the time, and that damped the amplitude. So that essentially the discovery of the mechanism associated with that. This work was published early this year in Nature Communication, and this is just finished by an example of patients. So this is 65-year-old, and this is how the experiment looked like. So this would be the arm. This is a motion sensor accelerometer. This is time indication when it's on. This is its tremor frequency. We apply the phase of 0. So this is a baseline recording for 15 seconds. So we get the tremor baseline. And after 15 seconds, we will start to stimulate. Again, this is short stimulation of 30 seconds. Then we measure after that. So the stimulation is now ramping up. And it's applying to the brain of this subject, again, non-invasively, but a particular phase relative to the movement that we measure here. And of course, it doesn't disappear completely, but you can see a clear difference. And remember, this is a very short stimulation on the magnitude and the strength of this basically oscillation. We stop the stimulation now. Now we're going back to post-stimulation period, and eventually it will return back. So to summarize, we talked about basically, yeah.
Nir?
Yeah.
I think we should come slowly to an end.
That's exactly the end from my side.
It's now about 9:15, and maybe there are more questions. Any more questions? Don't be shy. You have the chance now to ask. Sind Sie nicht schüchtern? Fragen Sie. Sie haben jetzt die Chance.
Do you have an idea for how long is the effect?
On the tremor? So the simple answer is no. This was just an experiment or study that we did to see if this concept can just work. And now we are setting up essentially a study to try to do that. So one will stimulate for a longer period and see essentially how long it's sustained. So when we stop the stimulation, or maybe if we repeat it for a couple of days, how long that sustains? That's exactly the question that one needs to answer next. So we don't know that. We just know there is a potential for a new type of intervention for this patient.
When I studied hundreds of years ago, I heard a lecture from Grenoble, who made the first brain stimulation in Parkinson's disease after the late retardic syndrome, after neuroleptics. You remember? Did you know what I mean? And when you so when you take neuroleptics, you have those dyskinesias. Mm-hmm. You can have the dyskinesia. So this would be also a treatment for those dyskinesias without deep brain stimulation.
Well, I don't know. I think the challenge that we have is one need a very clear activity in the brain to target. And with dyskinesia, I'm not aware of that. Yeah, I mean, of course, the brain activity is different, but what exactly is different and where exactly different, what exact pattern of activity is difficult to say. So here, a tremor is very unique, no? Because you have its very periodic basically signal that we can just measure without even measuring from the brain because it's coming to the hand. So that is very unique in that sense. So it's an interesting question how far one can basically expand on this concept to other motor disorder. I think one of the interesting one, at least in the context of Parkinson, is biokinase, or basically slowing of movement. So this is the main challenge of a patient with Parkinson. They have difficulty to initiate movement. And that actually has a very clear signature in the brain, in the motor cortex. Essentially, if one measures the activity in the motor cortex when we initiate movement, there is essentially, we need to suppress a particular oscillation called the beta band oscillation. It's about maybe 12 to 24 hertz to 30 hertz that exists in the motor cortex. Without suppression of this oscillation, we cannot initiate movement. And these patients have an elevated level of such activity in the motor cortex, and that could potentially become a target. And in fact, today, the new trend in deep brain stimulation is to use this as a kind of a marker when to stimulate and when not to stimulate. Because as I mentioned before, and to date, we were just stimulating all the time with this invasive deep brain stimulation. One of the challenges with that is eventually the battery ends, and then you require surgery to repair the battery. And of course, there's more side effects. So there's been an active research how to reduce that. Yeah.
So any more questions? Okay, fine. Well, Nir, thank you very much.
Of course.
There's still a lot of challenges ahead of you, I see. And please carry on. I wish you plenty of strength and enthusiasm as you have shown it this evening to us. And yes, carry on for the sake of mankind. Thank you very much indeed, and for this fascinating lecture and your engagement for our community.
Of course, pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Ja, und Ihnen allen danke ich sehr herzlich, dass Sie die fast eine gute, dicke Stunde mit uns geteilt haben und sich auch eingebracht haben. Und ich wünsche Ihnen eine gute Nacht und bleiben Sie gesund. Lassen Sie sich impfen, wenn Sie noch nicht geimpft sind.
Thank you, Nir. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.